"Sit down. Shave it all." That was the first thing the American guard said to me in the summer of 1943, inside the camp in Arkansas. No threats, no beatings, just an order that felt heavier than chains. My hair had survived jungle rain, lice, and months of fighting. It was proof I had endured. And now, in a few seconds, it was gone. The buzzing clippers cut more than hair. They cut rank, pride, and the idea that I was still a soldier. Some men cursed under their breath. Others stared at the floor. A few even admitted they felt relief. Was it humiliation? Or was it a strange kind of mercy? That day, in that wooden barrack, we argued among ourselves, but the truth was more complicated than any of us wanted to admit. Stay with me. Because what happened after that razor changed how I saw captivity forever. The order came without shouting, without the strike of a rifle butt. The guards simply pointed to the chairs, their rifles slung but ready. It was July 1943, Arkansas, hot enough that the air itself felt heavy. We were marched in groups of 50 into a long wooden barrack that smelled faintly of soap, sweat, and timber. The room was bare except for 2 chairs, a mirror, and the clippers. The first man sat down stiffly. His hair was long, tangled, and carried the smell of mildew and months of battle. The buzzing started, and in seconds clumps of hair slid down his shoulders, dropping onto the dusty floorboards. Nobody spoke. It felt worse than a beating. We had endured hunger, disease, and gunfire. But this was different. This was erasure. I watched his face in the mirror. He didn't look like a soldier anymore. He looked like any man, stripped of everything that marked him as a fighter. He stood up with his scalp bare and his eyes fixed on the floor. We all knew then what was happening. The Americans weren't just cutting our hair. They were cutting our pride. When my turn came, I sat stiff, gripping the wooden arms of the chair. The guard pressed my head forward, and the clippers tore across my scalp. The sound was mechanical, loud in the silence. My hair fell away in clumps, and I stared at the wall in front of me, refusing to look at my own reflection. In those minutes, I felt more exposed than on any battlefield. My hair had been proof of endurance, a mark of survival. Now it lay in a heap at my feet. Back in the barracks that night, the whispers started. Some of the older officers muttered that it was humiliation, a calculated act to break us. They said the Americans wanted us to look the same, faceless and stripped of rank. Others disagreed. A few of the younger men admitted it felt like relief. One said it was the first time in months he hadn't felt lice crawling on his scalp. Another said the air felt cleaner against his skin. The officers were furious at those words. To them, admitting relief was admitting weakness. They reminded us that we were soldiers of the emperor, and suffering was proof of loyalty. But the younger men had tasted a strange freedom, not from captivity, but from the filth we had carried for so long. I lay awake on my bunk, scratching the smooth skin of my head. It was raw, alien. I wanted to feel only shame, and I did. But I also felt lighter. That contradiction gnawed at me, humiliation mixed with something close to comfort. The next morning, when we lined up for roll call, the shock deepened. We looked at one another and barely recognized ourselves. 50 men, heads shining under the sun, like rows of monks. The differences between us, officer, sergeant, private, were gone. Rank meant little when every head was bare. I saw bitterness in the officers' eyes. For them, it was more than hair. It was the loss of status. Among the younger prisoners, though, a few jokes began to circulate. They rubbed their scalps and smirked. "We all look the same now," one whispered. Another said we could pass as Americans if only we smiled. A few laughed softly, then quickly covered their mouths when the guards turned. Even in captivity, humor slipped through. The real shock came later that day. A prisoner, not an American, was handed the clippers. He had been a barber in Osaka before the war. Now he was told to shave his own countrymen, under guard supervision. We watched him with mixed feelings. Some muttered traitor under their breath, accusing him of serving the enemy. Others envied him. He had a role, a purpose, maybe even extra rations. As I watched him shave the next man's head, I realized something. The razor was doing more than cutting hair. It was cutting through us, dividing us into groups, those who resisted, those who accepted, and those who saw opportunity. That night, the arguments grew louder. Some said the barber was dishonoring us by helping the guards. Others defended him, saying he had no choice. I stayed silent, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The razor had turned one of us into both victim and tool. In the days that followed, the routine continued. More prisoners arrived, more heads shaved. The floor of the barrack was always littered with clumps of black hair. Guards swept it up like trash, piling it in bags and burning it outside. Watching the smoke curl into the summer sky made my stomach twist. It was as if they were burning the last traces of who we had been. And yet, with each day, something else became harder to deny. The lice were gone. The smell of sweat and rot was weaker. For the first time in months, I could lie on my bunk without scratching myself bloody. I wanted to believe it was only humiliation, but part of me knew it was also survival. That was the worst part, the confusion. Was this act meant to strip us of dignity or to keep us alive? We argued about it every night. The officers clung to the idea of shame. The younger men leaned toward relief. I was caught in between, torn by a question that had no answer. All I knew was this. The razor had done more damage than any bullet. It had taken my pride, but it had also given me back a piece of comfort I didn't want to admit I needed. The shaving itself was one thing. The mirror was another. A week after our arrival, they led us into a different barrack. This one had tables, benches, and, most shocking of all, 2 large mirrors fixed to the walls. None of us had seen our own faces clearly since leaving Japan. The jungle, the islands, the ships, the battles, they gave us no time or tools for reflection. We lived without mirrors, without reminders of what we looked like. Now, with our heads shaved, the Americans made us stand in line again. One by one, we were told to step forward and look. I didn't want to. I tried to stare at the floor, but the guard tilted my chin up. My reflection stared back at me. The face was thin, skin stretched over sharp bones, eyes hollow, cheeks sunken. But the most shocking thing was the scalp, bare, shiny under the light, no trace of the soldier I once believed myself to be. I hardly recognized the man in the mirror. He looked older than my years, beaten down. He looked like a stranger. The man next to me gasped when he saw his reflection. He covered his mouth as if ashamed of what was looking back. Another muttered, "That's not me." "That can't be me." One officer spat on the floor and turned away, refusing to look again. But not everyone reacted with disgust. A younger prisoner leaned closer, almost curious. "I look clean," he said softly. The guard overheard and smirked. That small comment caused an uproar later in the barracks. That night, the arguments grew sharper. "This is humiliation," one lieutenant snapped. "They strip us, shave us, make us stare at ourselves like animals." His voice carried the anger of someone whose identity rested on appearance and rank. "Don't forget who you are. Don't let them erase you." But another voice rose from the corner. A farmer's son, barely 20, shook his head. "For the first time I see myself clearly. No dirt, no lice, no filth. Maybe it's not humiliation, maybe it's starting over." The words caused murmurs. Some scoffed, others fell silent. I lay on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, torn between both sides. The mirror had unsettled me. It had shown me the truth. I was not the strong, enduring soldier I imagined. I was just a thin, broken man with no hair and no control over his own life. But I also couldn't deny the feeling. Seeing myself without the grime of the jungle, without the tangled mess of hair, there was a strange clarity. Shame and relief mixed in equal measure, and I hated that I couldn't decide which was stronger. The next day, I overheard two guards talking in English. One laughed and said we all looked like monks. The other replied that neat appearance made prisoners easier to manage. That word, manage, stuck with me. They weren't cutting our hair to be kind. They weren't doing it to humiliate us either. They were doing it because neatness was control. Inside the camp, that truth became clearer each day. Haircuts weren't the only routine. Showers, inspections, clothing checks. Everything was tied to appearance. If you looked clean and orderly, guards treated you with less hostility. If you resisted, you were singled out. It was simple. Discipline was measured not just by behavior, but by how you looked. In the barracks, the mirror became a subject of obsession. Some avoided it, afraid to confront what they saw. Others began to line up willingly, brushing their bare scalps, even adjusting their uniforms before standing in front of the glass. For the first time, grooming became part of our captivity. One night, an older sergeant whispered a story from home. He said that in Japan, criminals were sometimes forced to shave their heads as a mark of disgrace. "That's what this is," he said bitterly. "They are branding us without ink." But the barber, our fellow prisoner from Osaka, offered another view. "No," he said quietly, "this is not branding. This is discipline. They believe order comes from appearance. Maybe that's why they are stronger." His words silenced the room. None of us wanted to admit it, but deep down, we knew he might be right. The mirror kept haunting me. Each time I looked, I saw less of the soldier I had been and more of the man I was becoming, a prisoner, stripped of symbols, left only with routine. It was painful, but it was also grounding. Weeks later, I noticed something else. Fewer men were sick. Fewer men fought over petty things. The lice were gone. The smell of rot was gone. The barracks were calmer. The officers still clung to their anger, but the younger men settled into the routines. Discipline had been forced on us, and strangely, it worked. Still, the shame lingered. Every time I touched my scalp, I remembered that first day in the chair, the buzzing clippers, the shock of the mirror. It stayed with me longer than gunfire ever did. Looking back now, I wonder if that moment in front of the mirror was the real breaking point. Not the battles we lost, not the surrender, but the day we faced ourselves stripped of everything. For some, it was humiliation. For others, it was survival. For me, it was both, and that contradiction has never left me. The haircuts had done more than change our appearance. They had split us in ways I had never seen in the Imperial Army. Back in battle, there was only one rule: obey. Officers commanded, soldiers followed. Rank was unquestioned. Even in hunger and disease, the chain of command held. But inside the camp, with our heads shaved and uniforms marked PW, something shifted. The first cracks appeared in whispers. At night, lying on the wooden bunks, the officers muttered that the Americans were humiliating us. "This is their way to destroy our spirit," one captain hissed. "Do not give in. Do not let them strip you of who you are." His voice was sharp, steady, like he was still commanding troops on the battlefield. But across the room, a younger soldier whispered back, "At least we're not itching anymore. At least we're not filthy." His words were quiet, but they carried weight. Men nodded in the shadows. Others clenched their fists. The officers could not tolerate it. One lieutenant struck the younger man across the face the next morning, shouting that he had dishonored his family by finding comfort in enemy rules. The guard standing nearby didn't intervene. He just watched. To the Americans, our quarrels probably meant nothing. To us, it meant everything. By the second week, the arguments grew louder. Some men insisted the shaving was a tool of humiliation, a way to make us docile. Others argued it was simple discipline, even necessary. If we fight lice, we stay healthy. If we stay healthy, we survive, one said. That logic was dangerous because it made sense. Survival, not honor, became the argument. The officers tried to stop it. They gathered the men who still respected them and spoke in hushed meetings. They warned us that accepting these routines would make us soft. Remember the emperor, one said. Remember what it means to be Japanese. Endurance, not comfort. But his words no longer landed with the same force. The war felt far away, and the routines of camp life pressed closer each day. The barber, the prisoner from Osaka, stood at the center of the divide. Each time he shaved a head, eyes followed him. Some looked with contempt, others with envy. He did his work in silence, hands steady, clippers humming. One night I asked him if it bothered him to cut our hair for the enemy. He shrugged. I cut hair before the war. I cut hair now. It's the same hands, only the walls are different. His calmness unsettled me more than anger would have. Among the younger men, a strange thing began to happen. They started comparing their shaved heads, joking about who looked meaner or cleaner. Some even rubbed their scalps like Lucky Charms. It was nervous humor, but it lightened the air. For them, the shaving had already lost its sting. For the officers, it was a daily wound. The Americans, of course, encouraged the routine. They scheduled regular inspections. Guards walked the rows, checking our scalps for stubble, ordering us to shave again if our hair grew even slightly long. We were treated like recruits in basic training, not like defeated soldiers. That detail broke the officers most of all. They had commanded men in battle. Now they were ordered to stand in line with privates, waiting for razors. One day, a colonel refused. He folded his arms and declared he would not sit in the chair. The guards did not shout. They simply waited. 2 more stepped forward with rifles at the ready. The barber looked frozen, clippers buzzing in his hand. After a long silence, the colonel sat. The razor touched his scalp, and the room fell quiet. We all watched as his silver-streaked hair fell to the floor. For us, it was the final proof. No one, not even the highest officer, could escape this rule. That night, the barracks erupted. Some men whispered that the colonel's surrender to the razor meant we had lost everything. Others said it showed there was no shame in obedience, only survival. I lay awake, caught between both sides. I remembered the jungle, the endless hunger, the bodies left unburied. What had all that pain given us? Only this: a place behind wire, our heads shaved, our pride in pieces. But there was another truth I couldn't ignore. For the first time in months, sickness was fading. No one coughed as much. No one scratched until bleeding. The barracks smelled less like rot. Health returned slowly, and with it, a dangerous thought. Maybe the Americans knew what they were doing. This was the real divide. Not between officer and soldier, but between honor and survival. Some still clung to the idea that dignity meant refusing comfort. Others saw that comfort might keep us alive. And in captivity, survival mattered more each day. The arguments never ended. They flared at night, during meals, even in the barber's chair. But in silence, when the clippers buzzed and the hair fell, most of us surrendered, not to the Americans, not to the guards, but to the reality of captivity. I touched my bare scalp again and again, as if trying to remind myself it was still there. The smoothness felt strange, foreign. I hated it. And yet, deep down, I knew the razor had not just cut our hair. It had cut the army we once were into fragments, leaving behind men who no longer agreed on what it meant to endure. The man with the clippers was one of us. His name was Sato. Before the war, he had cut hair in Osaka, running a small shop near the train station. In battle, he was just another soldier. In captivity, he became something else. The guards chose him because he had steady hands. At first, he resisted. He muttered that he was no tool of the Americans, but when they put the clippers in his hand and told him to shave or be punished, he obeyed. None of us could blame him, yet many did. The first time he shaved another prisoner, the room went silent. Watching a fellow countryman cut our hair under American eyes felt worse than when the guards did it themselves. Some muttered, "Traitor." Others spat on the floor when he walked past. But Sato didn't flinch. He worked quietly, one head after another, clippers buzzing without pause. I sat in his chair the second week. He didn't look at me. His hand pressed my head forward, and the razor skimmed across my scalp. For a moment, I hated him. I wanted to call him weak, a servant, but when I looked into his eyes, I saw no weakness, only emptiness, a man doing what had to be done. In the barracks, talk about Sato never stopped. Some claimed he had betrayed us, helping the enemy strip away our dignity. Others said he was clever, securing a position that gave him purpose. A barber in camp had more freedom. He moved between barracks, spoke to guards, sometimes received better rations. That small difference was enough to make men jealous. The irony was bitter. In Japan, Sato had been just another tradesman, cutting hair for a few coins. In camp, his skill made him important. Soldiers who had once outranked him now sat in his chair, heads bowed, forced to submit to his clippers. Watching a colonel endure Sato's hands was a sight none of us had expected. Rank vanished under the razor, but power, even in small doses, changes a man. Within weeks, Sato's presence grew heavier. He never bragged, never smiled, but everyone knew he controlled something others did not. Guards trusted him with the clippers. Prisoners needed him for every shave. Slowly, respect replaced suspicion. Men began asking favors. Cut mine shorter. Spare me the sting. Give me a mirror after. I watched as prisoners who once spat at him now spoke politely. They didn't like him, but they needed him. In captivity, need mattered more than pride. Yet the resentment never vanished completely. One night, a young private accused Sato of enjoying his role, of taking pleasure in making us look like monks. Sato said nothing. He just lay on his bunk, eyes closed, as if the words passed through him like wind. The silence unsettled us more than an argument would have. The truth was, many of us envied him. Cutting hair gave him work, and work gave him meaning. The rest of us filled our days with nothing but waiting. He had routine, skill, purpose. In a place where time blurred, that was a kind of power. I began to see it differently. Each time I sat in his chair, I thought about the absurdity. Here was a man who had once cut businessmen and children in Osaka, now cutting soldiers in captivity. His hands hadn't changed. Only the walls around him had. Maybe he wasn't betraying us at all. Maybe he was surviving, just like the rest of us. The officers hated him most. They despised that a former barber could hold clippers over their heads, literally and symbolically, but they couldn't stop it. They sat in his chair like everyone else, their rank invisible once the clippers buzzed. Sato never hesitated, never bowed lower, never gave them special treatment. That, in its own way, was his quiet revenge. Weeks turned into months. Sato's role only grew. Guards gave him small privileges, extra soap, better tools, sometimes a word of casual trust. He became a bridge, moving between authority and captivity. The rest of us remained behind wire, faceless, but he carved out a place for himself. The strangest moment came when the Red Cross visited. Inspectors walked through the camp, noting our conditions. They stopped by the barber's chair. Sato shaved a prisoner calmly, the clippers buzzing. The inspector nodded with approval. To the world outside, our shaved heads were proof of order, discipline, and humane treatment. To us, it was proof that control had reached even our scalps. After they left, some men cursed him again, but most stayed quiet. They understood now. Sato was not the enemy. He was the mirror, showing us what captivity really was. One evening I asked him if he hated what he did. He paused, then said, "Hate? No, I don't think about it. Hair grows. I cut. It grows again. It's work. That's all." His words stayed with me. Maybe he had found the only way to survive, by treating it all as routine, not humiliation. By making himself useful, he had kept a piece of himself intact. I realized then that the razor had not only divided us, it had reshaped us. The officers clung to pride and anger. The young sought comfort, and Sato, the barber, built a strange kind of power in the middle of captivity. Looking back, I think the Americans understood this. They knew that giving one prisoner the clippers would do more than enforce hygiene. It would break hierarchy, spread envy, and create order without firing a shot. And it worked. By the third month in camp, the razors were only part of the routine. What shocked us most was how the Americans built an entire system around appearance, cleanliness, and time. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like a machine that never stopped running. We were told when to bathe, when to shave, when to change clothes. Showers were scheduled in shifts. Lines of prisoners marched into long concrete rooms with rows of shower heads. Hot water poured down in steady streams. At first, many resisted. In the jungle, water had been for drinking, not washing. Dirt was a badge of toughness. To waste water on showers felt absurd, but the guards stood at the door, counting, making sure each man stripped, washed, and scrubbed. Refusal was not an option. Soap was handed out in bars stamped U.S. Army. The smell was sharp, chemical, unfamiliar. It burned the skin at first, but it also stripped away months of filth. The first time I lathered it onto my body, I felt both humiliated and relieved. I thought of home baths in Japan, warm and ritualized. This was not that. This was forced, mechanical, supervised. Yet I could not deny that afterward my skin felt lighter. Inspections followed. Guards walked the rows, eyes sharp, checking our scalps, our faces, our uniforms. Stubble was noted, dirty fingernails corrected, untidy clothing punished with extra duty. They didn't beat us, but their discipline was relentless. Order was enforced not by cruelty, but by routine. Uniforms were another part of the system. Our ragged jungle clothes had been taken away long ago. In their place, we wore plain cotton or denim marked with large white letters, PW. At first, the uniforms felt like another brand of shame, an erasure of individuality. But over time, we noticed something strange. They were repaired when torn, replaced when worn out, even laundered on schedule. Laundry became its own ritual. Clothes were collected in baskets, numbered, and returned days later, clean and folded. Sheets were washed, blankets pressed. We were stunned by the efficiency. In battle, we had worn the same uniforms until they rotted. Here, our clothes were kept in better condition than we could have imagined. Some men said it was kindness, others said it was control. I began to believe it was both. The officers hated the uniformity most of all. In the Imperial Army, rank was everything. Insignia, medals, even the cut of a uniform showed status. Here, every man wore the same cotton, the same letters across the back. Colonels and privates looked identical. The system erased hierarchy in one stroke, and the Americans seemed to know exactly what they were doing. The inspections, the showers, the shaved heads, the clean clothes, it all worked together. At first, it felt like humiliation, but gradually it began to shape us. Fewer men were sick. The lice were gone. Fights became less frequent. Even our moods shifted. Guards treated neat prisoners with less hostility. Sloppy, men drew reprimands. Discipline came not from fear of beatings, but from the pressure to conform to the system. Some nights I thought about the contrast. In Japan, we had been taught that endurance meant filth, that suffering was noble. Here, order meant cleanliness, discipline measured by hygiene. Two philosophies stood against each other. Which one was stronger? I didn't know. The Americans seemed almost indifferent. They didn't shave our heads to mock us. They didn't hand out soap to be kind. They did it because it was procedure. Their discipline was mechanical, detached, and that made it more unsettling. Cruelty we could understand. Routine was harder. I began to see the larger picture. Every detail, the haircuts, the uniforms, the showers, the inspections, was designed to reduce chaos. It kept us busy, predictable, controlled. Idle men could plot escapes, stir unrest, or resist. Clean, occupied men were easier to manage. The strangest part was how effective it was. Weeks passed, and many of us began following the routines without resistance. We shaved before inspections, bathed when told, folded our uniforms as instructed. Not because we wanted to, but because the system made refusal pointless. Slowly, the routines became habits. One evening, lying on my bog, I realized something. The Americans hadn't broken us with violence. They had reshaped us with order. We were no longer soldiers of the emperor, wild and starving in jungles. We were prisoners of a machine that ran on schedules, soap and razors. The officers still tried to resist, preaching about honor, warning us not to grow soft, but their voices grew weaker. Their shaved heads and clean uniforms made them look no different from the rest of us. Authority faded in the face of routine. I touched my scalp again. The hair was always short now, never more than a thin shadow before the clippers came again. I hated it still, but I had stopped fighting it. That, perhaps, was the real victory of the system. It wasn't about kindness. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about control, achieved not through pain, but through discipline so ordinary that we didn't even notice when it became part of us. And that, I realized, was far more powerful than any weapon. At the beginning, every order felt like an insult. Shave your head, bathe at this hour, wear this uniform, line up here. We told ourselves it was humiliation, that the Americans were stripping us of dignity piece by piece. And maybe they were, but as weeks turned into months, the edges of that humiliation dulled. The first change came in small ways. Men who had refused to shave started stepping into line without protest. They still scowled, but they no longer fought. Showers that once felt like punishment became part of the rhythm of life. We even began to wait for them, if only because they gave us a brief relief from the heat. Soap, which had burned our skin at first, became something we quietly valued. The smell lingered on our hands, strange but not unpleasant. I noticed it in myself, too. At first, I touched my bare scalp with anger, as if it reminded me of what I had lost. But after a while, I touched it out of habit. I stopped thinking about loss and started noticing practical things. Fewer lice, no itching at night, fewer sick men coughing in the barracks. These were not luxuries on the battlefield. Here, they became normal. The contradiction unsettled me. In Japan, we had been told that endurance was the highest virtue. Dirt, hunger, disease, all of it was proof of loyalty. To find comfort here, under the enemy's rules, felt like betrayal, but the comfort was real. The barracks smelled cleaner. The men fought less. The constant scratching, the infections, the fevers, they faded. It was harder and harder to pretend that nothing had improved. Not everyone accepted it. Some officers kept warning us. They said the routines were designed to soften us, to erase the warrior spirit. "You are forgetting who you are," one major said during roll call. "You are becoming like them." But his words no longer carried weight. His shaved head looked just like ours. His uniform bore the same white PW. He had no more authority than any private. The system had leveled him as much as it had leveled us. The younger men adapted fastest. They joked about their shaved heads, compared who looked meaner. even rubbed their scalps for luck. A few began to show pride in looking neat, as if it made them less invisible. Watching them, I felt uneasy. Was this resilience or surrender? I remember one night clearly. A soldier who had once cursed the barber now asked him for a cleaner cut. "Shorter this time," he said, "so it lasts longer before inspection." No one laughed. No one called him weak. It was practical, and in captivity, practicality mattered more than pride. That was when I realized the shift was complete. We were no longer resisting. We were adjusting. The guards noticed too. They treated compliant prisoners differently, less suspicion, fewer harsh words. Men who shaved and kept their uniforms tidy were given lighter duties. Those who resisted were singled out, punished with extra work. Slowly, the logic became clear. Appearance was discipline, and discipline was survival. In private, I wrestled with it. I hated that I had grown used to the routines. I hated that I no longer felt rage each time the clippers buzzed. But I also knew that the anger had drained me more than the razor ever did. Letting go of it made life easier. That was the part I despised most, the ease of acceptance. Over time, the humiliation transformed into habit. We shaved when told, bathed when told, dressed when told. Not because we wanted to, not even because we feared punishment, but because it became normal. In the strange way of captivity, routine replaced freedom. Looking back, I think the Americans understood this better than we did. They didn't need to break us with cruelty. They only had to keep us clean, orderly, predictable. And in time, we would do the work ourselves. By the winter of 1943, I hardly remembered what it felt like to have long hair. I only remembered the sound of the clippers, the smell of soap, the touch of clean sheets. Shame was still there, buried deep, but it no longer ruled me. Habit had taken its place. That was the true transformation. We didn't stop being prisoners when we shaved our heads. We became prisoners the moment we accepted the razor as routine. When the war finally ended and the gates of the camp opened, we stepped outside as free men. But freedom did not erase what had happened inside. Even now, decades later, I remember the buzzing clippers, the piles of hair on the barrack floor, the faces in the mirror. Back in Japan, people asked questions. They wanted stories of battles, of suffering, of honor. I could tell them about hunger, about wounds, about watching men die. But what I could never explain was how much a simple razor had changed me. Who would understand that? To them, hair was nothing. To us, it was everything. I avoided mirrors for years. Every time I saw my reflection, I remembered the first time I looked at my shaved head in Arkansas. I remembered the shame that burned my chest and the relief I dared not admit. That contradiction followed me like a shadow. Some former prisoners never spoke of it. They carried the shame silently, afraid that families would see their survival as weakness. Others laughed bitterly, saying the Americans had made monks of us all. A few even admitted openly that the routines had saved their lives. Sickness, lice, infection. Those things killed men in war faster than bullets. Cleanliness kept us alive. But saying that aloud felt dangerous, as if it betrayed the idea of honor we had been taught. For me, the memory is both a wound and a lesson. I cannot forget the officers' rage, their warnings that we were losing our spirit. I also cannot forget the younger men who rubbed their shaved heads with relief, joking in whispers when they thought no one would hear. Both truths lived side by side in that camp, and both live inside me still. When I pass a barber shop now, the sound of clippers makes me pause. I see the faces of men lined up in silence, the piles of hair swept into corners, the guard watching from the doorway. I hear the colonel's voice breaking when his silver hair fell to the floor. I see Sato, the Osaka barber, his hands steady as he worked, his face blank as if it were just another day in his shop. I think about Sato often. He found a way to survive without shouting, without breaking, simply by doing what he knew best. Was he a traitor? Or was he the only one who understood that survival required letting go of pride? I still don't know. The Americans never explained their rules to us. They didn't need to. The system spoke for itself. Neatness was discipline, hygiene was control, routine was power. They proved that order could conquer without cruelty. That lesson unsettled me more than any battlefield defeat. Sometimes, when I touch my head out of habit, I feel the ghost of that bare scalp. My hair grew back long ago, but the memory never did. The razor cut more than hair. It cut away the soldier I thought I was and left behind a prisoner who had to decide each day whether survival was worth more than honor. I survived. That is the truth. I am here because of soap, uniforms, razors, and routines I once despised. But survival carries its own weight. I wonder if those who died in battle, with hair unshorn and pride intact, would judge us for living this way. The older I get, the less certain I am. Maybe honor was in dying. Maybe honor was in living. All I know is that in 1943, in a camp in Arkansas, the sound of clippers told me that war was not just fought with bullets. It was fought with routines, with systems, with small acts that reshaped men without their consent. And in the end, it was those small acts, the shave, the soap, the folded uniform, that stayed with me longer than the battles ever did. That is what captivity means. Not chains, not hunger, not violence. Captivity is when you wake up one day and realize you no longer resist the razor. You sit down, you bow your head, and you let it take the last proof of who you thought you were. I survived, but I left part of myself on that barrack floor, in clumps of black hair burned away in the Arkansas sun.